Well, thanks for inviting me along to talk this afternoon. My name is Richard Padley. I'm the Managing Director of Semantico, and there's going to be three parts to the talk today. First off, I'm going to look at the market kind of considerations. Second part, tech. I'm not going to get too tech, but I am a techie, so if anything needs decoding, save up those questions to the end, and we'll see if we've got a chance to answer or address any of those. And then thirdly, I'm going to hone in on that specific question, which is the kind of teaser that's in the program, if you like, which is, well, you know, are we developing apps here? Are we developing mobile websites here? Are we going to deliver our content as EPUB? Where's the sweet spot? And, so we're going to be looking at that in some detail at the end there. I wanted to kind of open up really to start off with just a kind of quick question, because I think it's always good to get the blood going around after lunch, and we've all had some good healthy German food for lunch. And so, I mean, how many people here have either developed apps or are thinking of developing apps in the next 12 months? Okay, so you now know more than I do, probably. No, I'm just joking, actually. We've done some apps as well. Nonetheless, it's good to get a kind of a sort of temperature gauge there. That's really actually very that's great. So let's first off let's look at some of the kind of market side of the equation. This is, if there's one takeaway from what I'm going to say, this is probably one of the big ones, and it's probably one that everybody's well familiar with. But I just think it needs to be drilled down into in a bit more detail. This is a report. This is one of the outputs of a report from Morgan Stanley predicting mobile growth over the next few years. And what they're saying is that smartphones, web-enabled smartphone devices, are going to overtake installed base of desktop PCs within the next 5 years. Okay, what does that mean? In terms of implications for publishers and delivering content. Actually, Gartner have got a similar take on this, but they're saying it's even more aggressive. They're saying within 3 years there are going to be the same number of mobile-enabled smartphones as desktop PCs. That's a pretty staggering number, and it means we've got to do something, to make sure that we're addressing that absolutely growing market for consuming content in that way. We know from other reports from Deloitte, for example, that the web traffic from mobiles is growing 8 times faster than traffic from PCs. So the kind of installed base of PCs is relatively static in this equation. The huge growth factor is coming from mobile devices. Let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Let's think about how that actually plays out into the different kinds of smartphones that are out there in the market. So again, this is figures. This is a very volatile market as well. So every time we talk about any figures or any results, they're out of date straight away. So this is obviously well out of date, being at the end of the second quarter of this year. Nonetheless, a phenomenon that you've probably heard talked about here is how Android is catching up with iOS devices, with the iPhone, with the iPod Touch and so on. We can see that Symbian has got the absolute lion's share of the market there in terms of sales there. That's Symbian is the operating system that's inside Nokia and Sony devices, and they're absolutely still taking up the vast majority of the sales side of the equation. Research in Motion, that's your BlackBerries, obviously they're still there, but they're very, very challenged now by Android and by Apple as well. Other devices trail into insignificance in proportion. That's one side of the equation, how it actually sells. What I think is actually more interesting and more relevant, though, is where, which ones of these devices are generating traffic? Where's the traffic coming from? Well, we see a different picture here. Now, what I had to do to, these figures are actually measuring ad traffic. Okay, so I'm using this as a proxy for web traffic as a whole. This is looking specifically from an organisation called AdMob, who are monetizing mobile advertising. So they're publishing figures on their traffic stats, and However, I think this is still a good proxy for web traffic as a whole. What we see here is a very, very different picture. So you can see that there's an absolutely huge, well, apparently anyway, an absolutely huge proportion of traffic being generated from iPhone devices, from iOS devices, and a very large chunk as well from Android. BlackBerry seems to have disappeared out of the equation. Clearly, people aren't surfing the web terribly much on their BlackBerries. Great device for email, probably not so good for web browsing. Symbian still there, obviously, as a kind of dominant part of the sales share, but much smaller segment in terms of web traffic. So now unpick this a little bit further. Why does that segment for iOS look so big? What's the kind of is it just that Apple users just love surfing the web so much that they can't help themselves and they don't do anything else all day long? No, actually, what's going on there is that we're not comparing like with like in a way. We're seeing that this is the first set of figures are talking about mobile smartphone handsets. The second set of figures we're talking traffic from all kinds of other devices as well. On the Apple side, anyway, we're talking about iPod Touch, which isn't a smartphone, but it's measured as the same platform, and developing apps and so on, which we'll come on to later, is exactly the same for it. So we're actually seeing a big chunk there, which is blowing out the Apple figure in a way, because it's measuring traffic from iPod Touch and from iPad as well. And that's one of the reasons, at least, why those figures look a little bit bigger. They would probably, you've got to take that into account anyway, because we're talking mobile here, and we'll come on to the whole picture of the kind of ecosystem and all the different technologies and devices that we're talking about when we talk mobile in a little bit. So that's really the picture as far as those stats go. One of the things I wanted to talk about was app stores. So there's a lot of them about, actually. Obviously all of the handsets and platforms have got their own app stores, with the Android marketplace, the Apple App Store, obviously, a whole host of other ones, and then there's a whole bunch of third-party platforms. So there's a huge and growing marketplace in app stores themselves. And although it might seem like it's a done deal, it's far from a done deal. Obviously, Apple control their platform very, very tightly. There's only one place you can buy apps. But when you look outside that platform, it gets much, much more complex, and there's a much more bigger ecosystem of places you can go to get your apps from. Okay. That's interesting in itself, but what I think is more interesting actually is just how do people, what's happening when people are, buying applications, buying content from these stores? What's the kind of behavior there? And if we're looking at this across the market there, it's useful to get some information about how the different platforms stack up. Now, I haven't got my hands on figures to across the whole spectrum of different platforms there that we were looking at earlier. This is just focused in really on the kind of Apple devices and Android and WebOS 2, which is Palm. That's the Linux-based operating system. So what this is showing us, and this is a survey which comes from that same company AdMob, about which was polling users on how much on their purchasing behaviour, how many of them bought one or more apps a month, and what you do see here is quite a clear sign that the fact that Apple control their environment, that they build one app store that's really easy to purchase apps for, actually pays through in terms of repeat generation of sales there. A lot more users seem to be happy buying repeat purchasing apps from Apple than they do on the Android store, for example. So and that's nearly twice as many as well. That's interesting. Let's look at that. Let's look at the Apple App Store in a little bit more detail, again, partly because there's some good metrics that we can get our hands on there. What I want to do is just look at the profile of different kinds of apps in the App Store now. And again, you're probably well aware of what the top of this pile looks like. The book apps are vast. There's nearly 50,000 book apps on the Apple Store now. Out of a total of 270,000 apps overall on that store. So this, not only is there what appears to be a staggeringly large number of applications, that the fact that the book app category is so large needs a bit of drilling down into, actually, because what's happening there, I think, is that we've got to ask a kind of quality question about that. there's a lot of people with cookie cutter applications that are putting public domain books from things like Project Gutenberg, and they're building them up into book apps, and they're shoveling them out onto the Apple App Store. So there's just every time every time I'm coming into one of these statistics, I'm trying to unpick it